Through petroleum energy, people and products are now transported speedily and economically throughout the nation and the world. Man's desire for freedom of movement has been fulfilled with petroleum.
This is the American dream of freedom on wheels.
Through petroleum, Americans now travel with efficient economical power, while the complex machinery that carries them is protected and lubricated with oil. Through oil, our nation's defenses are maintained with a speedy mobile army, as well as a fast, hard-hitting Air Force. Our flexible, long-range Navy and Merchant Marine now move with oil.
We got a real problem. America is addicted to oil, which is often imported from unstable parts of the world. America is addicted to oil. I know it came as a shock to some.
From the dawn of history, mankind has revealed an unconquerable urge to improve his lot. Along with his requirements of food and shelter have been the deep-rooted desires to reduce drudgery and to move freely beyond the horizons of his limited domain. Time and space have always presented their challenge. Man early recognized that energy must be found, harnessed, and properly applied to help him. But throughout many centuries, man was unprepared to see the potential servant in a substance that occasionally seeps from the Earth's crust, oil. Little did they know that oil such as they encountered would someday be a source of freedom from toil and drudgery. Early American Indians used the oil that they found as a medicine and ointment. And even in the 1800s, petroleum, recovered as a nuisance byproduct of brine well drilling, was sold as a cure-all. But now the progress of civilization had set the stage for an awakened interest in petroleum. Animal fats and tallow could no longer supply the ever-growing need for candles and lubricants. Whale oil, which had long been the chief illuminant, was becoming scarce, yet the demand for artificial light was increasing. In 1850, a lamp capable of efficiently burning a refined product of petroleum was invented. Petroleum, it seemed, might supply the growing need for lubricants and light, but digging for it at seeps could not supply it in sufficient quantities. Throughout millions of years since the Earth's formation, constant heaving, buckling, and erosion have changed many portions of the Earth's surface. Many areas were repeatedly covered by shallow seas. Countless billions of tiny organisms died and settled to the bottom, where they became buried under sand and silt. There, it is believed, the entombed organisms were transformed into oil. Accumulated pressures of gases, water, and earth sometimes drove the oil through the porous sand and sedimentary rock. And often, it migrated to underground reservoirs sealed by non-porous formations where the oil was trapped. It is from these reservoirs that oil is now most likely to be recovered in commercial quantities.
In 1852, a Canadian inventor named Abraham Gessner discovered how to make kerosene from crude petroleum. In an age when candles and whale oil provided the only light after sundown, it was a dramatic discovery. Borrowing a page from alcohol distillers, Gessner used a primitive still-type system to distill and refine crude petroleum by heating it and separating its various elements. One of those elements was kerosene, which he found burned longer and cleaner than whale oil. Within a year of Gessner's discovery, his kerosene works was producing 5,000 gallons a day, and the need for more crude petroleum became critical. By 1859, 34 startup companies were producing $5 million worth of kerosene annually. The rush to find oil, and with it, huge fortunes, was on. On August 29, 1859, with the project on the verge of cancellation, Drake came to check on Smith. He found the blacksmith and his sons not drilling, but standing guard at the site. Around them were tubs and barrels filled with oil.
With the rapid spread of the news came a fantastic migration of those who saw in this development a possible source of new wealth. The boom was on. Towns and derricks sprang up almost overnight in the vicinity of Drake's discovery. For lack of engines and drilling equipment, many crude but ingenious drilling methods were devised. Strong backs and legs and infinite patience supplied the power to drill only a few feet per day. With the realization that many drillings resulted in expensive and disappointing dry holes, so-called experts with divining rods, luck, and intuition were much in demand. Yet the combined efforts of these pioneers resulted in rapidly increasing oil production. Waiting for slow and inadequate transportation, oil piled up at the well sites. Storage became a vital problem. Anything that could hold oil was pressed into service. Thousands of wagons and teams became regularly engaged in hauling the oil to the nearest shipping points. When possible, barges and rafts were employed to carry the oil. Such transportation proved inadequate in supplying the fast-growing market. And so in 1865, the first oil pipeline was laid over a 5-mile distance from Pithole City to the railroad. Today, the distribution of petroleum and its byproducts has in itself become a tremendous enterprise. A network of pipelines is an essential part of this undertaking. Modern machines have greatly eased and speeded the task of digging the trenches and preparing the thousands of miles of pipe required. Pipes were formerly screwed together, but modern welding techniques help produce a continuous and unbroken artery of steel. Before they are buried, the pipes are thoroughly cleaned. They are next covered with a special compound that resists the corrosive action of the chemicals in the soil. Further protection is given by a smooth spiral wrapping. Thus, the life and serviceability of the lines are prolonged. A gigantic system of pumping stations forces petroleum and its products over and through all kinds of terrain. Under modern methods, various oil products are pumped through the same line in adjacent sections or units. Modern oil tankers and barges account for a large percentage of the bulk transportation of oil and oil products. The tankers are indispensable for the overseas movement of oil. Railroad tank cars have also kept pace with oil development, many of them having specially prepared compartments. They daily carry millions of gallons of various oil products. Machines powered by oil now enable the farmer to produce 3 times as much as he could before oil became his faithful ally. Oil heats the farmer's home as well as his brooders. It protects his fruit trees from killing frosts, and oil products are used to spray his trees. No longer a slave to the soil, the farmer has been freed to enjoy a fuller life and an ever-improving standard of living. At this critical stage appeared the invention that was to revolutionize the oil industry's course of progress and change the living habits of the nation. No longer was gasoline destined to be a useless byproduct. Instead, with the swift popularity of the automobile, gasoline quickly assumed the position of prime demand. The recognition of oil as an economical and easily handled liquid source of power was the springboard for a new era of magnificent progress. Inspired by the American system of possible reward for risk, discovery and expansion swept westward to the Pacific, the mid-continent, the Gulf Coast, and the Rocky Mountains. The oil industry quickly found its stride in the suddenly stepped-up tempo of progress. It has been estimated that the energy available from our current output of petroleum would be equivalent to the labor of about 10 times as many people as there are in the world. The modern $30 billion oil industry is a large factor in the support of our national economy through wide-scale direct and indirect employment. And through a limitless variety of products and uses, it is contributing to nearly every phase of American living. In the relatively few years since the oil industry's inception, traditions of progressive service and responsibility have been established, which will be the foundation for even greater contributions to the welfare of the nation and the world.
In the United States, oil was once a source of power. More than any other vital material, oil was central to the American way of life.
What it comes down to is that the oil industry has to please Mrs. Martin and millions just like her. Already today, she's used some 87 petroleum products, including the plastic bacon wrapper and the wax of the milk carton.
It was in 1945 that the President of the United States, at that time Franklin Roosevelt, first grasped the nature of this crisis.
We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself.
I just want to remind what FDR said in 1936. He said, "We had to struggle with the old enemies of peace: business and financial monopoly, speculation, reckless banking, class antagonism, sectionalism, and war profiteering."
Franklin Roosevelt first looked ahead and saw that the United States eventually would become dependent, and he was the one who pioneered a foreign policy based on oil.
I should like to see this nation geared up to the ability to turn out at least 50,000 planes a year.
98% of our transportation energy comes from petroleum products. We couldn't move goods around our country without oil. Our entire agricultural industry is highly mechanized and dependent on petroleum for herbicides and pesticides and fertilizers. And then if you think of the million products that are made from petrochemicals, all the plastics and pharmaceuticals and cosmetics and paints and lubricants, all of these industries rest on an abundant supply of petroleum. And that's why when petroleum becomes scarce or the price of petroleum rises, the entire economy is affected. But at the same time, Roosevelt understood that the United States would no longer be able to supply its forces with oil in the future because we were using up so much of our domestic reserves. And this is what worried Franklin Roosevelt most in the final months of World War II. And so he set out to find a foreign source of oil to make up for the decline in American reserves. The fateful meeting on February 14, 1945, between the President of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and the King of Saudi Arabia, Abdulaziz ibn Saud.
He had faith that somewhere within these far-reaching sands was the key to a richer life for the Saudi Arabs, who so long had known scarcity and want. Perhaps this country, so unproductive on the surface, might contain minerals below the surface, including oil. But vast sums would be needed for search and development, and there was no quick way to a realization of this hope. Then, in the early 1930s, an American oil company obtained a concession on Bahrain Island, 25 miles out on the Persian Gulf. The venture was successful, and occasionally there was speculation as to whether even greater opportunities might lie across the green waters of the Gulf in Saudi Arabia. And so, geologists talked about the possibilities, and they saw the low rise along the coast that could mean oil or could mean nothing at all. They debated and debated, and finally recommended that the risk be taken. But whether these unknown sands would justify the outlay of millions of dollars was still a decision that had to be made by the company directors in San Francisco, 11,000 miles away. East and West are united in pioneering a new frontier of progress, serving the interest of the Saudi Arabs, serving the interest of the United States, and demonstrating the vitality of the American system of free enterprise. A system which, from this new frontier, is pumping into the trade of the world oil, one of the materials that is making a truly great contribution to our modern civilization.
On one hand, the leader of the free world, a passionate advocate of democracy and freedom, sitting next to an absolute monarch who is accompanied by slaves and astrologers and Bedouin bodyguards. No records were kept of this meeting, but all historians and American policymakers agree that the basis of the discussion was that henceforth the United States would provide the royal family with protection in return for an exclusive American right to develop Saudi Arabia's oil. And every American president since then has reaffirmed the U.S. alliance with Saudi Arabia.
Our relations with Saudi Arabia have been long, close, and cordial. As the venerable Arabic saying has it, our house is your house.
There's an Arab saying, the sands are blowing. And I submit to you, King Fahd, that if the sands of time give us any hint of the future, it is that in the days ahead, the friendship between the Saudi Arabian and American people will be a strong and vital force in the world.
So even when American presidents speak about our deep commitment to the spread of democracy worldwide, and we rail against other countries, Iran or Sudan, Venezuela, for their lack of democracy, we conspicuously ignore the total lack of democracy in Saudi Arabia year after year after year.
We Americans are a do-it-yourself people. We're an impatient people. Instead of teaching someone else to do a job, we like to do it ourselves. And this trait has been carried over into our foreign policy.
We have created a very elaborate military establishment in Saudi Arabia, providing some of the most sophisticated arms in the world, providing military training to the kingdom, military advisors of stationing troops in the kingdom. The modern Saudi military really is a creation of the United States. We've had military missions there for decades. And there can be no explanation for that other than the fact that the royal family guarantees our access to Saudi Arabian oil. In fact, when the United States sent troops to Saudi Arabia in 1990, after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, then Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney told the Senate Armed Services Committee that the reason the United States was coming to the rescue of Saudi Arabia was because of the agreement between Roosevelt and Abdulaziz.
Our strategic interest in the Persian Gulf region, I think, are well known, but bear repeating today. We do, of course, have historic ties, especially to the Saudis, but other governments in the region, that hark back with respect to Saudi Arabia to 1945, when President Franklin Delano Roosevelt met with King Abdul Aziz on the USS Quincy towards the end of World War II, and affirmed at that time that the United States had a lasting and continuing interest in the security of the kingdom.
11,000 miles from San Francisco, 8,000 miles from New York. There lies a primeval desert, a mass of drifting sand and sun-baked earth 1/3 the size of the United States. A place of ancient glories. Long ago, a center of thriving trade where came the merchants from India and China to barter their wares for the spices and the incense. Wherever the limited water supply permitted, wheat was grown. And the Arab, essentially good-humored in spite of his hard life, would make a little dance and a little song as he threshed the grain. Winnowed out the wheat by letting the wind blow the chaff away. But crops, judged by modern standards, were pitifully small. And for townspeople and Bedouin alike, life was an endless struggle. None of them knew that this desert, barren of natural resources to the outward eye, had been blessed by nature beyond the wildest dreams of those who raided and struggled for life across its sandy, wind-swept wastes. On May 29, 1933, after weeks of discussions, there was a meeting at Qasem Palace on the outskirts of Jeddah. It was there that Saudi Arab government officials representing His Majesty signed a concession covering roughly 320,000 square miles. This was the starting point of a new American business venture abroad. But ahead, there was a long, long distance to travel, a huge investment, years of effort, and no end of patience and perseverance. Most important of all, the job would require men, hardy men, determined men, men who were willing to leave families and friends and journey halfway around the world on a quest that might end in failure. Men who could face hardship and monotony and still take it. They weighed and decided, and gradually they began to arrive. Carpenters, machinists, riggers, technicians, drillers, executives too, eager to extend a welcoming hand clasp to the new arrivals. And who is that over there? Why, sure enough, Paul Strong. Paul had forgotten back in the States that he had that traditional American characteristic, a hunger for adventure and challenge. He and the others had come to learn of the Middle East, and they found the going was tough. Few outsiders had ever before been beyond the treaty port of Jeddah, and the Arabs were suspicious of these strange newcomers. Many of them were frankly hostile and were quite ready to show their feelings. Even the extended hand of friendship was accepted grudgingly in the early days. A long road has been traveled since those early years. There have been changes and great expansions. The original concession has been enlarged and now embraces an area of 440,000 square miles, equal to the states of California and Texas combined. Since that first paying well established Dammam as a major oil field and Saudi Arabia as an oil country, other fields have been discovered. Production has risen until in 1947 it reached close to 19 million barrels from less than 4 million in 1939. In the prolific Abqaiq field, production by the end of 1947 was averaging about 200,000 barrels a day. Oil from Abqaiq is sent by pipeline to Dhahran, about 40 miles away. From there, more than 100,000 barrels daily flow through one of the world's largest underwater pipelines to the Bahrain Petroleum Company's refinery on Bahrain Island. The rest is moved by pipeline for shipment abroad, or for processing in the company's refinery on the mainland at Ras Tanura. materials have been arriving in the Persian Gulf for the world's largest pipeline, a project of the Trans-Arabian Pipeline Company, an affiliate. The first leg, from Abqaiq to Qatif, has been completed. The Trans-Arabian Pipeline route lies across 1,075 miles of desert, plains, and coastal ranges to the Mediterranean. When completed, it will carry about 300,000 barrels daily. Total Saudi Arabian crude oil and products available at sea terminals will amount to nearly 700,000 barrels daily during 1951. By that time, the investment of the company and of the Trans-Arabian Pipeline Company will have exceeded $400 million.
Declassified documents show that the Truman administration was so concerned about a possible Soviet takeover of the Persian Gulf that they contrived plans to plug up Saudi Arabian oil fields in case the Soviets came in and took over the area and we were forced to abandon the region. But he was fearful that the American public wasn't ready for military intervention in the area, so he decided to couch this in terms of a vast Soviet conspiracy against free peoples around the world.
If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world, and we shall surely endanger the welfare of this nation.
And that became known as the Truman Doctrine. But if you look closely at the diplomatic history, you will find that what was really on the minds of American policymakers at the time was the possibility of a threat to Saudi Arabia and the oil flow from the Middle East. And the same geopolitical concern over Soviet domination of the Persian Gulf and its oil shaped the Eisenhower Doctrine.
The Middle East has abruptly reached a new and critical stage in its long and important history. If the nations of that area should lose their independence, if they were dominated by alien forces hostile to freedom, that would be both a tragedy for the area and for many other free nations whose economic life would be subject to near strangulation.
The oil flow from the Persian Gulf is so essential to American security and well-being that we'll do anything necessary to protect it.
If power-hungry communists should either falsely or correctly estimate that the Middle East is inadequately defended, they might be tempted to use open measures of armed attack. If so, that would start a chain of circumstances which would almost surely involve the United States in great military action.
In the Persian Gulf, the Nixon Doctrine was focused specifically on Iran, where the United States embraced the autocratic Shah of Iran to be our surrogate, our proxy. And it was the Shah who was chosen to protect U.S. interests. And we provided billions and billions of dollars to the Shah and to Iranian forces to protect the oil. And this surrogate strategy worked fine until the Shah of Iran was overthrown in 1979.
Suddenly, Iran is no longer one of this country's strongest and most dependable allies in the strategic Persian Gulf area.
The autocratic Shah was replaced by the Ayatollah Khomeini, who adopted an anti-American stance. This produced tremendous panic in Washington because there were no proxies left to defend the oil.
Mr. President, the Persian Gulf is one of the great mineral treasures of the whole world. Most of Japan's oil and an awful lot of Europe's oil passes through there. The Shah really was the policeman of the Gulf and kept the oil flowing. Now, the new civilian government says it's not going to be the policeman of the Gulf anymore. What's going to happen to this terribly, terribly important part of the world if there is no policeman?
And so it was decided that the United States would have to take up this role itself and not rely any longer on surrogates to protect American interests in the Persian Gulf region.
Let our position be absolutely clear. An attempt by any outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States of America, and such an assault will be repelled by any means necessary including military force.
I am not frightened by what lies ahead, and I don't believe the American people are frightened by what lies ahead.
President Carter lost the election in 1980, and Ronald Reagan stepped in. And despite all of his criticism of Carter, Reagan took the initiatives of the Carter Doctrine and beefed them up even further.
Deterrence means simply this: making sure any adversary who thinks about attacking the United States or our allies or our vital interests concludes that the risks to him outweigh any potential gains. Once he understands that, he won't attack.
And among his first actions was to take the Rapid Deployment Joint Task Force and make it even bigger, and it was he who converted it into the Central Command in 1983. Central Command is a very recent addition to the roster of America's unified commands. We've long had a European command, a Pacific command, a Southern command in Latin America, but there was none in the Middle East. And this is where most of the world's remaining oil is located. President Reagan created the Central Command to exercise control over American forces in that middle part of the world.
As long as Saudi Arabia and the OPEC nations there in the east, and Saudi Arabia is the most important, provide the bulk of the energy that is needed to turn the wheels of industry in the Western world, there's no way that we could stand by and see that taken over by anyone that would shut off that oil.
The original function of the Central Command, very clearly elaborated by the Reagan administration, was primarily to protect the flow of oil from the Persian Gulf to the United States and markets around the world. That's always been its primary focus. This is the period of the Iran-Iraq War, which broke out in 1980 and intensified in 1986-1987, when the Iranians started attacking Kuwaiti oil tankers in the Persian Gulf. What Reagan did is say, okay, let us stick American flags on the stern of Kuwaiti oil tankers, which means it's legitimate to protect them by the American Navy. And that's exactly what happened.
After months of policy confusion and political debate, the U.S. Navy is poised today just outside the Persian Gulf to escort the first 2 Kuwaiti tankers past Iranian guns. 5 warships to be used in the first leg have a mix of almost every weapon in the Navy's arsenal.
It was a clear use of military force explicitly to protect the flow of oil. There was no other motive for this. There was no freedom at stake, no democracy at stake, no terrorism at stake. It was simply to keep the oil lanes open.
We remain deeply committed to supporting the self-defense of our friends in the Gulf and to ensuring the free flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz.
In our country, war is a very serious business. We're a democracy, and we take war very seriously. We believe that war is something that should be a matter of extreme duress if the country comes under attack, or in extreme cases of genocide or egregious human rights. High principle is at stake, not economic interests. We will never be free from the dangers of endless wars in the Middle East until we disassemble this large military apparatus that has been created for the protection of Middle Eastern oil. When Iraqi forces invaded Kuwait, the first President Bush gave the Carter Doctrine its most extreme, most substantial implementation.
It is about our own national security interests and ensuring the peace and stability of the entire world.
When President Bush met with his advisors at Camp David on August 3rd and 4th, the fear was that Saddam Hussein was within striking range of Saudi Arabia's oil fields, and this created a panic situation in Washington.
This will not stand. This will not stand, this aggression against Kuwait.
And President Bush concluded at that moment that we had to act militarily.
We have sent forces to defend Saudi Arabia. The integrity of Saudi Arabia, its freedom, are very, very important to the United States.
What's so interesting here is how clear it was in August and September 1990 that oil was the trigger for U.S. intervention in the first Persian Gulf War.
Our jobs, our way of life, our own freedom, and the freedom of friendly countries around the world would all suffer if control of the world's great oil reserves fell into the hands of that one man, Saddam Hussein.
But this aroused protests around the country, and polling data showed that the public was firmly opposed to a war in the Middle East for oil. So over the course of the next few months, Bush changed his tack.
Some people never get the word. The fight isn't about oil.
And he stopped talking about oil.
I'm deeply concerned about Saddam's efforts to acquire nuclear weapons.
Saddam Hussein systematically raped, pillaged, and plundered a tiny nation.
And oil simply disappeared from the discourse.
And that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with Hitler revisited, a totalitarianism and a brutality that is naked and unprecedented.
And increasingly elaborate reasons were given for going to war.
We had kids in incubators, and they were thrown out of the incubators so that Kuwait could be systematically dismantled.
And only then did Congress vote in support of that first war.
Your government lies to you to get you to go to war. And then the news media are stenographers because they're owned by the people who make profits off war. And they're funded by them. Why do you think climate change is still a debate on network news? It's because they're funded by fossil fuel companies. The first Gulf War with 1991, George Herbert Walker Bush. And I don't know if you remember it, there was a problem. The people didn't want to go to war because we still remembered Vietnam, even in 1991. And so they had to figure out a way to get people to go on board with it. And what they usually do is propaganda. And here's this is a great little piece that explains what happened.
Iraq attacks Kuwait, claiming the Kuwaitis are slant drilling into Iraq's oil fields. U.S. President George Herbert Walker Bush pushes for a land war against Iraq. But polls show the U.S. public is split 50-50 on that idea. Then comes this eyewitness testimony.
So the country split 50-50 on us going into Kuwait and Iraq. And then
for a congressional committee from a 15-year-old Kuwaiti girl. The claim is she cannot be identified for fear of reprisals.
So we have to keep this 15-year-old girl whose testimony is going to swing the war. We have to keep her identity a secret because someone might come to get her for telling the truth. Here we go.
While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators. Took the incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor.
The U.S. public is outraged. The result? Support for land war zooms.
Boom! That's all it took. That's all it took was that testimony. And I remember, I'm old enough to remember when that's before the internet, when that happened. And I remember that being on the news, all ubiquitously shown on the news about how horrible. And I was like, oh my God, we have to attack. And here.
Turning point. Desert Storm is launched. 135,000 Iraqis are killed. An estimated 1 million Iraqis, many of them children and old people, then die as a result of 10 years of sanctions. One small problem. There never were any incubator baby deaths, not one. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's investigative flagship program, The Fifth Estate, reveals the girl to be the Kuwaiti ambassador's daughter, given her lines and coached in acting by the giant American PR firm Hill & Knowlton. It's one phase in a $10 million joint U.S.-Kuwaiti campaign of deception. This man is lying.
I myself buried 14 newborn babies that had been taken from their incubators.
This man is lying.
And they had kids in incubators, and they were thrown out of the incubators so that Kuwait could be systematically dismantled.
There were a lot of people who participated in a conspiracy. Yes, an out-and-out conspiracy of fake organizations, false documents, fraud, and disinformation.
Bush made the decision to send American troops to Saudi Arabia to defend the kingdom. But King Fahd was deeply worried about the presence of so many American troops on Saudi soil. This, after all, is the Islamic Holy Land, and there's a great deal of discomfort with the presence of so many infidels, as they're called, non-believers, in the Islamic Holy Land. So Bush sent his Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, to Saudi Arabia to persuade Fahd to allow the American troops in, because that was the only practical means of driving the Iraqis out of Kuwait, and Bush understood that. Cheney brought with him satellite photos, which have never been made public, allegedly showing that Iraqi forces were on the border of Kuwait and Saudi Arabia poised for attack, in order to persuade Fahd that he was in danger and that American troops had to be sent immediately. But Fahd had another offer of support from an unusual source. The volunteers who went from Saudi Arabia to Afghanistan in the 1980s to fight the Soviet Union with American support. Their leader was a man named Osama bin Laden, a Saudi citizen with close ties to the royal family, who had been working with the CIA in Afghanistan to drive out the Soviet Union. And he was trying to persuade the royal family to allow his forces to defend the kingdom against Saddam Hussein and not rely on the Americans. And so it took Cheney a great deal of persuading to get Fahd to agree to allow the American troops in.
I made to the king, at the direction of the president, and meeting with him in Jeddah on August 6th included specifically that we were prepared to deploy significant force to the kingdom, sufficient force to deter further aggression. Secondly, that we would stay as long as we are needed. And third, that we will leave when we are no longer needed or when we are asked to leave. And those, I think, were important considerations in the king's mind.
And it was this last condition, that American troops leave as soon as the fighting in Kuwait was over, that convinced King Fahd to accept the American offer and to reject the offer from Osama bin Laden. But when President Bush announced the victory in Kuwait at the end of February 1991, the decision had been made already not to invade Iraq, but to contain it from outside.
None of us want to move forces into Baghdad or frankly, we don't want to have any more fighting.
But the Americans would have to remain in Saudi Arabia to enforce the containment strategy. And so Fahd was faced with the permanent presence of American troops. And it was this repudiation of the U.S. promise that turned Osama bin Laden from an ally of the United States into a sworn enemy of this country.
The bodies of 5 Americans killed in a bomb attack in Saudi Arabia.
Car bombs exploded today outside a United States training facility in Riyadh.
A truck bomb exploded at the gates to a U.S. Air Force facility in Saudi Arabia this evening. There are deaths and there are scores of casualties.
Early this morning, 2 U.S. embassies in East Africa were the target of bombs. One ripped through the embassy in Dar es Salaam, the capital of Tanzania, at about 3:40 a.m. Eastern Time. Almost simultaneously, 450 miles to the north, a blast tore through the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi.
The USS Cole was attacked in Yemen. Al-Qaeda militants rammed an explosives-laden boat into the ship, killing 17 sailors.
Today, we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
Because 9/11 was such a earth-shattering event, we tend to forget what Bush focused on in those early months of his administration.
What people need to hear, loud and clear, is that we're running out of energy in America. One thing is for certain, there are no short-term fixes.
Reality is the nation has got a real problem when it comes to energy.
He came into office at a time when there was another energy crisis.
California is at ground zero of the energy crunch, suffering through rolling blackouts and soaring electricity rates.
Whoa, I thought this was only supposed to happen in California.
Big League Baseball was stopped.
We had kind of a rolling blackout here.
Power company pulled the plug again on some businesses there and in Iowa and Illinois.
There were blackouts and long gas lines in many parts of the United States and high prices.
America faces a major energy supply crisis over the next 2 decades. The failure to meet this challenge will threaten our nation's economic prosperity, it will compromise our national security, and literally alter the way we live our lives.
And so, immediately, in one of his first acts, President Bush created the National Energy Policy Development Group, the NEPDG.
President Bush made a big new push today for his energy agenda with Vice President Cheney as his point man.
They began work almost immediately after taking office, issuing their final report, the National Energy Policy, on May 17, 2001.
I am really pleased with the work the Vice President and his folks did. This is a very optimistic look at America.
This is the major energy blueprint that continues to govern American energy policy today. So you would think that the administration would want to let the American public know who met with them when they framed it and what went on in those meetings.
Vice President Dick Cheney and congressional investigators may be on track for a head-on collision in court. Tomorrow is the deadline for deciding whether to take legal action to try to force Cheney to grant access to records of Cheney's Energy Task Force.
Dick Cheney has refused to make public the minutes of those meetings. All we know is who he met with, the top executives of America's leading energy companies, led by Chevron, ExxonMobil, and what was then the Enron Corporation before it went bankrupt. We also know that he refused to meet with any environmentalists.
We're going to make decisions based upon sound science, not some environmental fad.
Now, among the recommendations of the report, as is well known, is that the United States should allow drilling in Alaska at the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, or ANWR. It's very clear from reading through it that we have to rely increasingly on the Middle East and other foreign areas to satisfy rising U.S. requirements. Essentially, the report calls on the Persian Gulf producers to double their output over the next 25 years, and calls on the U.S. government to take the necessary steps to make sure that this will occur. And at the very same time that the Cheney Commission drew this conclusion, the Department of Defense was conducting a review of American military policy headed by Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. That study, going on simultaneously, concluded that the United States had to beef up its capacity for what's called power projection, an ability to project military power into the rest of the world. And they focus on exactly the same areas of the world that the Cheney report talks about. So there was a meshing of the energy requirements of the Cheney plan and the defense thinking of Donald Rumsfeld. And this leads to what I call the strategy of maximum extraction. The strategy of maximum extraction requires that there be governments in place in the Persian Gulf countries that will ensure that their countries are pumping oil to supply American needs over the next 25 years.
Well, Saudi Arabia made it clear, and has made it clear publicly, that they will not use oil as a weapon.
Now, you have such regimes in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. Two countries do not have such regimes: Iraq, up until 2003, and Iran today. From Washington's point of view, these are spoiler countries.
There are places that have oil that are using oil as a weapon, or using oil as a carrot for certain policies, and that's troubling.
If you read Osama bin Laden's words, his fatwas, you cannot escape seeing oil as lying at the root of Osama bin Laden's war against the United States. And so in our alliance with the royal family, which is rooted in our addiction to Saudi Arabian oil, we have in fact provided the fuel for Middle Eastern terrorism.
Oil. Is it about oil?
Helen, as I've told you many times, if this had anything to do with oil, the position of the United States would be to lift the sanctions so the oil could flow. This is not about that. This is about...
The issue is not about Iraqi oil. If the United States had wanted access to Iraqi oil, we could have dropped our whole policy 12 years ago.
There's been a lot of speculation in the world, and I suppose it's understandable, suggesting that the interest of the United States and the coalition countries that are concerned about Iraq relates to oil. It does not relate to oil. I mean, it just plain doesn't.
Our whole foreign policy and military policy establishment has been governed for 50 years by our commitment to defend the Middle Eastern oil states like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates. So much of our foreign policy has been tied up in this, and we have a vast military establishment that is totally committed to the protection of these regimes.
We're told to secure the southern Rumaila oil field up to the canal.
We just pulled out here yesterday just to come out and help protect the oil line.
In a tank?
In a tank.
Our military policy and our energy policy have become intertwined. They've become one and the same. Since the onset of the petroleum age in 1860, the United States has been the leading consumer of petroleum, and we remain so today. We have about 5% of the world's population. We consume 1/4 of the world's petroleum, about 20 million barrels per day out of total world consumption of 80 million barrels. But until you really investigate this, you don't appreciate just how deeply our economy is dependent on oil.
Where is all this oil coming from that we're storing here in the U.S.?
Well, the United States is effectively becoming the world's sponge for oil. Storage is much less expensive here in the United States than at sea, and it costs roughly $1.50 a month to store at sea. Well, it's 50 cents a barrel here, and there's been a massive construction wave of new storage capacity here. So what's happening is U.S. production and Canadian production is flowing to the U.S. Meanwhile, imports keep coming in even though we don't need them. And what we have become is the place where all the world's oil comes to sit until it's needed for refining.
The extraordinary thing about our addiction to oil is this addiction was formed when we were self-sufficient in the production of petroleum. Well into the 1940s, we produced all of the oil we consumed. Even in the 1950s and 1960s, we produced 80 or 90% of our oil consumption. It's only been in the past decade or so that we've become significantly dependent on imported oil. We now depend on imported oil for about 2/3 of our total demand, and it's expected to increase radically over the next 25 years, but our domestic production is plummeting.
As of 2014, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries reports that roughly 1.5 trillion barrels of proven reserves are still available. For comparison, some have estimated that 1 trillion barrels have been used since commercial oil drilling began in 1870. Today, the world consumes about 34 billion barrels a year, with China expected to account for half that usage within the next 5 years. But China only holds about 32 billion barrels itself. Roughly 80% of the world's oil comes from the 12 members of OPEC, with roughly 2/3 of the oil located in the Middle East.
The Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, is the most powerful oil group on Earth and directly competes with the United States, Russia, and Canada for oil supremacy. OPEC is headed by Saudi Arabia, which alone holds the second largest oil reserves.
The single largest reserve on the Earth is nowhere near most of the other OPEC countries. 20% of the world's oil is located in Venezuela, South America. They reportedly hold almost 300 billion barrels. Saudi Arabia comes in close with about 265 billion barrels. The third highest reserves, though, are found in Canada, which is a non-OPEC nation. In fact, of the 285 billion barrels held outside of OPEC countries, more than 60% is in Canada.
In 2014, the United States produced about 14 million barrels of oil a day, with the Saudis and Russians trailing right behind. But while the U.S. is the largest producer, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia stands as the world's largest exporter. Most of Asia relies on Saudi oil. Meanwhile, Europe relies on Russia, which provided nearly 1/3 of the continent's oil and natural gas in 2014. But while these three countries contribute the most oil, they don't actually control it. Just 12 countries, primarily in the Middle East, North Africa, and South America, hold about 80% of the world's oil.
Africa Command will enhance our efforts to bring peace and security to the people of Africa and to promote our common goals of development, health, education, democracy, and economic growth in Africa.
This is the first new regional military command to be created since the Central Command was created in 1980.
This command will enable us to have a more effective and integrated approach than the current arrangement of dividing Africa between Central Command and European Command, an outdated arrangement left over from the Cold War.
And in my view, this is directly related to the growing importance of African oil to the United States. And I fear in the future this could lead to the same kind of dangers that we face now in the Persian Gulf and Africa. And what makes this so much more dangerous is that we're not the only great power that is militarizing our foreign energy policy. China is following along the same path as we are.
China's economy is growing so fast it builds a city the size of Philadelphia every month. Oil is the rocket fuel for all this growth, and China made it clear today it will outspend the competition to secure it.
Like us, they are supplying arms and military equipment and training to regimes that they rely on for oil.
China's increasing wealth is also buying high-tech missiles and jet fighters capable of going one-on-one with the best America can deploy. This new China, some warn, is a whole new threat.
Russia has also become a player in all of this. In its effort to become a superpower all over again, Russia seeks to dominate the flow of oil from the Caspian Sea area in Central Asia, the flow of oil and natural gas. And so it is competing with the United States for control and dominance in these areas. That's the kind of dangerous situation that we see developing in the global pursuit of scarce energy supplies. And if we continue to rely on military force to solve our resource needs, we're in for a very bloody and dangerous and painful century indeed.